The sharp crack of the slap sliced through the air, a sound so jarring it drowned out the steady hum of the gas station. The clatter of fuel pumps, the chatter of hurried customers, the distant rumble of engines. It was a busy afternoon, the kind where people darted in and out, their minds on groceries or the next errand, but in an instant, that single sound halted everything. Heads swiveled, conversations fizzled into stunned silence, and all eyes zeroed in on the scene unfolding near a gleaming black SUV. A boy, barely old enough to call himself a teenager, reeled backward, his sneakers scuffing the asphalt as he clutched his burning cheek. His wide, glistening eyes, brimming with shock and unshed tears, locked onto the towering figure looming over him, a police officer whose face was twisted into a sneer, smug and unyielding, as if he'd just swatted a fly and was proud of it. "Get out of the car now!" the officer barked, his voice a thunderous growl that carried over the lot. His meaty hand shot out, seizing the boy's slender wrist in a grip so tight it made the kid wince. With a rough yank, he dragged the boy forward, treating him like a discarded toy, weightless, insignificant. The officer's uniform shimmered under the blazing midday sun, the badge on his chest catching the light like a cruel taunt. But beneath the polished exterior there was no mistaking the poison lacing his words, the raw contempt that oozed from every syllable. The boy's voice trembled, a fragile thread of sound barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "I wasn't doing anything, sir," he whispered, his tone pleading, desperate to make sense of the storm crashing down on him. "I was just waiting for my dad." "Shut your mouth!" the officer snapped, cutting him off like a blade through paper. His grip tightened, fingers digging into the boy's skin as his sharp eyes flicked around the lot, scanning for anyone bold enough to challenge him. "People like you think you can just hang around wherever you please, huh? Not on my watch." His words dripped with disdain, each one a hammer strike meant to crush the boy's spirit. To him, this kid was nothing. A loiterer, a nuisance, a speck of dirt on the pristine order he enforced with an iron fist. From the driver's side of the SUV, a man emerged, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stepping into the open after sizing up its prey. The boy's father stood tall, his broad shoulders cutting an imposing silhouette against the glaring sunlight. His face was a mask of eerie calm, no flicker of rage, no trace of panic, just a stillness that sent a shiver through the onlookers brave enough to meet his gaze. They instinctively stepped back, sensing something unspoken, something heavy in the air around him. The officer's attention snapped to this new figure, his bravado swelling as he sized up the man. To him, the father was no different from the boy, just another nobody daring to interrupt his reign over this patch of asphalt. "You got something to say?" the officer sneered, his hand still clamped around the boy's arm like a vice. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "Maybe you should teach your kid some respect for authority before he lands himself in real trouble." His tone was a challenge, daring the man to step out of line, to give him an excuse to escalate this into something uglier. The father's response came steady and measured, each word carved from stone, honed to a razor's edge. "Let him go." His voice sliced through the tension, low and unwavering, carrying a weight that made the officer's smirk twitch, just for a heartbeat. But the man in uniform shook it off, letting out a hollow, barking laugh that echoed across the lot. "Or what?" he taunted, shaking his head as if the very idea amused him. "You gonna step up? Let me guess. You think you're somebody important. I deal with your kind every day, always mouthing off, thinking you can talk your way out of anything." "You're making a mistake," the father replied, his tone unshaken, his dark eyes boring into the officer with an intensity that seemed to peel back the layers of arrogance. The officer rolled his eyes, a dramatic flourish of exasperation, and with a shove, he thrust the boy toward the SUV. The force sent the kid stumbling, his knees buckling as he nearly hit the ground, his small frame trembling from the impact. A gasp rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath as the onlookers shifted uncomfortably, caught between fear and fascination. The father stepped forward, his presence swelling until it filled the space between them, commanding attention without a single raised decibel. His voice dropped, a deep rumble that vibrated through the air like distant thunder. "Do you even know who you just put your hands on?" The question hung there, heavy and loaded, a warning wrapped in velvet. The officer's laugh came again, colder this time, dismissive as he squared his shoulders and loomed closer. "I don't care," he spat, his blue eyes glinting with defiance. "You think a badge like mine takes orders from people like you?" For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The silence was thick, electric, the kind that draws strangers closer, that makes them linger on the edge of their toes, waiting for the next move. Every sound, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of a plastic bag caught in the breeze, felt amplified, every gaze locked on the trio at the center of this unfolding drama. Then the father spoke again, his words crashing through the murmurs like a thunderclap, sharp and final. "No, but you will." The officer's smirk faltered just for a split second, a crack in his armor quickly patched over with something darker, anger, maybe, or the first faint stirrings of doubt. He stepped closer, his chest puffed out, his neck craning forward. "Is that a threat?" he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You're about to find out what happens when people like you cross me." But the threat rang hollow because it wasn't the father who needed to fear what was coming. The air grew taut, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second, and then, like a dam breaking, the shift began. Whispers slithered through the crowd, soft at first, then rising into murmurs, then sharp gasps as recognition dawned on a woman near the edge of the scene. She squinted, her brows knitting together as she pieced it together. The man's quiet authority, the way he carried himself, the unshakable calm. "What's he going to do?" she muttered to no one in particular, her voice tinged with awe and a touch of dread. Another bystander, a lanky teen with a phone half raised, chimed in, his eyes wide. "Does he even know who that is?" The questions buzzed through the onlookers, a current of curiosity and disbelief. But the officer, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't hear them. He didn't see the tide turning beneath his feet. The boy, his cheek still throbbing from the slap, lifted his gaze to his father. A flicker of hope sparked in his tear-streaked eyes, cutting through the fear that had gripped him moments before. The father's hand settled on his son's shoulder, steady and warm, a silent promise that this storm would pass. For the first time, the boy felt a glimmer of something stronger than the nightmare swallowing him, justice, perhaps, though he couldn't name it yet. The crowd sensed it too, the energy crackling like static before a storm, every nerve alight with anticipation. The officer had no idea he'd just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. That single slap, that brazen display of power, was the pebble that would start an avalanche. He'd built his career on intimidation, on bending rules just enough to stay untouchable, but this time he'd miscalculated. The fallout wouldn't be quiet. It would roar through the city, a reckoning that would leave his name whispered in break rooms and barber shops for weeks. How far could one man's pride blind him to the truth? And when that truth finally broke through, would the boy and his father find the justice they deserved? The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the gas station lot. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind where people pulled in for a quick tank of gas or a cold soda, their lives a blur of routine. For 12-year-old Malik Carter, though, this stop was just a brief pause on the way home. He sat in the back seat of his dad's black SUV, his headphones dangling loose around his neck, his world shrunk to the sketchbook balanced on his knees. His pencil danced across the page, sketching a caped hero soaring over a jagged skyline, a quiet escape for a kid who rarely spoke but felt everything deeply. His dad, Darren Carter, had stepped inside to pay, leaving Malik to his drawings, oblivious to the eyes about to land on him. Darren was a man who carried himself with a quiet gravity, his 45 years etched into the lines of his face and the steady set of his shoulders. In jeans and a polo shirt, he blended into the crowd, but there was no hiding the authority that clung to him like a second skin. As the city's chief of police, He'd spent decades making hard calls, leading with a steady hand, and fighting to keep integrity alive in a job too often stained by corruption. He didn't wear his title like a crown. His achievements stayed tucked away, shared only with those who earned his trust. That day, he was just a dad running errands, thinking about Malik's favorite lasagna and how he might nudge his son to sketch something new. A tree, maybe, or a dog, instead of another superhero. Inside the convenience store, Darren handed a crisp bill to the cashier, offering a polite nod as the clerk fumbled with the change. His mind was already drifting to the evening ahead when something caught his eye through the smudged glass door. A police cruiser rolling into the lot, its lights off but its presence loud. His instincts, sharpened by years on the force, prickled faintly, though he brushed it aside. Not every cop car spelled trouble, but then he saw the officer step out and the air shifted. Officer Daniel Harper was a lean, wiry man in his late 30s, his sharp blue eyes scanning the lot like a hawk hunting prey. He'd been on the force for years, a veteran in name but not in honor. Around the precinct, his name came up in hushed tones, whispers of complaints brushed under rugs, of power trips that never quite crossed the line into official reprimands. Harper didn't wear his badge to protect. He wielded it like a club, a tool to command respect he hadn't earned. That afternoon, he was on a routine patrol, or so he'd claim later, when his gaze landed on Malik, sitting quietly in the SUV lost in his art. Harper's boots thudded against the pavement as he approached, his hand resting on his belt, his posture stiff with purpose. Something about the boy, the way he sat, calm and unbothered, lit a spark of suspicion in Harper's mind, a reflex born from years of seeing threats where there were none. "Hey, you!" he called, his voice slicing through the ambient noise like a whip. "What are you doing in there? Step out of the car." Malik's pencil slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floorboard as his heart jumped into his throat. He blinked up at the officer, confusion clouding his soft brown eyes. Was this man talking to him? Hesitant, he cracked the door open, his voice a shaky murmur. I'm just waiting for my dad, sir." But Harper wasn't listening. He was already moving, already deciding, and what came next would unravel everything. Justice doesn't arrive with a whisper. It storms in with a fury that demands to be felt. And as the crowd held its breath, as Malik clung to that fragile thread of hope, the officer's world was about to collapse under the weight of his own hubris. This wasn't just a story of a slap or a showdown. It was a lesson carved in fire about power, its abuse, and the consequences that follow when arrogance blinds a man to the reckoning at his door. The late afternoon sun hung low over the gas station, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt as the air thickened with tension. Malik stood trembling beside the car, his thin frame dwarfed by the looming presence of Officer Harper, whose sharp bark cut through the hum of idling engines. "I'm just waiting for my dad. He's inside," Malik managed to say, his voice quivering like a fragile thread about to snap. Harper stepped closer, his boots grinding against the gravel, his face hardening into a mask of disdain. Inside the small convenience store, Darren glanced up from the counter, his hands pausing mid-motion as he caught sight of Harper looming over his son. His brow furrowed, a storm brewing behind his dark eyes, and his stride quickened as he shoved the glass door open with a force that rattled the bell above it. Outside, the scene unfolded in slow, suffocating detail. Harper leaned in toward Malik, one meaty hand gripping the car's doorframe as the boy stumbled out, wide-eyed and unsteady. Malik's sneakers scuffed the pavement, his breath hitching as he clutched his sketchbook to his chest like a shield. "I wasn't doing anything," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of Harper's glare. The officer's lip curled into a sneer, his tone dripping with condescension as he snapped, "Don't argue with me, kid. You think you can just sit around here looking suspicious? I've seen enough of your type, loitering, stirring up trouble." The words stung like a slap, and Malik flinched, his fingers tightening around the worn edges of his notebook, the one place where his chaotic world made sense. Darren's footsteps echoed with purpose as he crossed the lot, each one deliberate, his jaw clenched tight enough to make the muscles twitch. He stopped a few feet from Harper, his presence steady and unyielding, like a boulder in a raging river. "What's going on here, officer?" His voice was calm, measured, but carried an undercurrent of authority that couldn't be ignored. Harper turned, his sneer faltering for a split second as he sized up Darren. Tall, broad-shouldered, but dressed in faded jeans and a worn jacket. Just another civilian in his eyes. "Your kid here was acting suspicious," Harper said, jerking his chin toward Malik. "Probably up to no good." Darren's gaze flickered to his son, who stood frozen, his sketchbook pressed so hard against his chest it seemed he might crush it. The boy's eyes were wide, pleading, a silent cry for rescue. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Then Darren spoke again, his voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "Let him go." Harper's laugh sliced through the air, sharp, mocking, and edged with cruelty. "Excuse me? You don't tell me how to do my job. Maybe you should teach your kid some respect." The tension crackled like static, drawing curious glances from the handful of customers lingering near the pumps. Darren took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, his calm unshaken despite the venom in Harper's tone. "I said let him go. He's done nothing wrong." Harper squared his shoulders, his chest puffing out as his voice rose, loud enough to carry across the lot. "And who exactly are you to tell me what to do? I don't take orders from you." Malik flinched as Harper's hand twitched toward him again, a predatory glint in the officer's eye. But Darren's voice cut through the growing crowd like a blade, sharp and unwavering. "You're making a mistake." Harper was too drunk on his own arrogance to hear the warning. To him, Darren was just another man daring to challenge his dominion, and Malik was just another kid who didn't belong in his neatly ordered world. Harper leaned in closer, his smirk widening as he muttered, barely audible but laced with venom. "I've seen your kind before. You think you're untouchable, but out here I'm the one in charge." Darren's eyes locked onto Harper's, steely and unblinking, a quiet fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. "You'll regret this," he said, the words hanging in the air like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. Harper chuckled, brushing it off as an empty threat, oblivious to the weight behind Darren's gaze. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd swelled, a low buzz of unease rippling through the onlookers. Phones emerged from pockets, their lenses glinting in the fading light as people began to record the confrontation. Malik glanced up at his father, a flicker of hope breaking through the terror that had gripped him. Darren's expression remained steady, but deep in his eyes there was a promise. A storm brewing, patient but inevitable. Harper, blind to the shift in the air, turned his back on Darren, his focus returning to Malik with a predatory intensity. But Darren didn't budge. He stood tall, his presence a silent command that seemed to pull the oxygen from the scene. The gas station lot, once a mundane backdrop of daily life, rattling soda cans and the faint smell of gasoline, now pulsed with an electric undercurrent, a sense that something monumental was teetering on the edge of eruption. The bystanders shifted uncomfortably, their whispers growing louder as the tension coiled tighter. Harper spun back toward Darren, emboldened by the attention, his voice thick with disdain. "Are you still standing there? I told you to step back." His hand rested on his belt now, fingers brushing the edge of his holster, a subtle reminder of the power he wielded. His gaze darted to Malik, who clung to his sketchbook as if it were his last tether to sanity. "And as for you, don't think you're walking away from this without consequences. I know how kids like you operate." Malik's voice broke through his fear, soft but defiant. "I didn't do anything wrong." Harper's laugh was a jagged thing, cruel and loud, making the crowd flinch. "Wrong? You think loitering in someone else's car isn't suspicious? What's in that notebook? Plans to rob this place." Darren's jaw tightened, his voice slicing through Harper's mockery like a honed blade. "That's enough. My son doesn't owe you an explanation. And if you keep this up, you'll find yourself answering questions you're not ready for." Harper turned slowly, his smirk twisting into something darker, more dangerous. He stepped closer, his voice dropping low and menacing, I've seen this attitude before. You think you're above the law, don't you? Just because you can string a few words together, you think you can intimidate me? Darren didn't flinch. His eyes bored into Harper's with an intensity that made the officer hesitate, if only for a heartbeat. Intimidate you? No. But I will hold you accountable. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward with a quiet certainty that chipped at Harper's bravado. The officer's hand shifted on his belt, a deliberate flex of authority meant to reclaim control. Accountable? You're out of your league, old man. From the edge of the crowd, a voice piped up, shaky, indignant, but brave. Why are you even bothering them? That kid didn't do anything. You're out of line. Harper's head whipped around, his glare silencing the bystander instantly. Mind your own business, he barked, before turning back to Darren and Malik. This isn't a debate. You don't get to make demands here. Malik's breathing grew shallow, his grip on his sketchbook so tight his knuckles whitened. He edged closer to his father, seeking refuge in Darren's shadow. Darren's hand settled on his son's shoulder, a steadying anchor that seemed to pour strength into the trembling boy, even as the weight of the moment bore down on them both. Not making demands, officer, Darren said, his voice low but resolute. I'm giving you a chance to walk away before this gets worse. Harper's face twisted into a sneer, his laugh hollow against the thickening silence. Worse? You're delusional. You don't have a clue who you're dealing with. The crowd shifted, their murmurs rising as more phones lifted to capture the scene. The tension was a living thing now, a taut wire ready to snap. Darren's expression didn't waver, but behind his eyes burned a controlled fury, a storm held in check by sheer will. Harper stepped closer, his voice dripping with venom. I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm calling this in, and you're going to regret wasting my time. Darren tilted his head slightly, his calm unshaken. Make your call. For a moment, Harper froze, caught off guard by the unflinching response. His hand hovered near his radio, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Darren took a small step forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. You think you have control here? You don't. Not anymore. Harper opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, a new voice shattered the standoff, loud, authoritative, and tinged with confusion. What's going on here? The crowd parted as a second officer approached, his boots scuffing the pavement. Younger than Harper, with a lean frame and a face still soft with inexperience, he took in the scene with a mix of bewilderment and unease. His eyes darted between his partner and the man standing calmly before him. Daniel, what's this about? Harper's posture stiffened, his confidence wavering as he gestured toward Malik. Loitering, suspicious behavior. The younger officer, Daniel, frowned, glancing at Malik's trembling form and the sketchbook clutched like a lifeline. He shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance in the air. Darren remained still, his gaze never leaving Harper, a silent testament to the consequences of unchecked power. In that moment, the lesson crystallized, not just for Harper, but for everyone watching. Justice wasn't a badge or a title. It was a force, patient and unyielding, waiting to exact its toll. Harper's arrogance had blinded him, but the cracks were showing, and the crowd knew it. The gas station, once a fleeting stop in their day, had become a stage for a reckoning, one where the cost of abusing authority would soon come due. The late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows across the gas station parking lot, its cracked asphalt shimmering faintly under the heat. A faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the distant hum of traffic and the sharp tang of gasoline. Officer Carter, the younger of the two policemen, stood rigid, his brow furrowing as he squinted at the scene unfolding before him. His eyes darted between Darren, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an unshakable calm, and Malik, the teenage boy sitting stiffly in the passenger seat of a weathered SUV. Something about Darren's presence gnawed at Carter. An instinct, a whisper in the back of his mind that this wasn't as simple as it appeared. His chest tightened slightly, unease creeping up his spine like a cold draft. Beside him, Officer Harper radiated a different energy entirely. Brash, unyielding, and teetering on the edge of fury. His face twisted into a scowl as he jabbed a finger toward the car. "Suspicious behavior," he growled, his voice thick with irritation. "He's just a kid sitting in a car. Are you sure this is even necessary?" Carter's words slipped out before he could stop them, tentative but laced with doubt. Harper's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing with indignation. "Don't you dare question me, Carter!" he spat, his frustration boiling over like a pot left too long on the stove. "I know what I'm doing here. I've got this handled." Carter flinched, the sharpness of Harper's tone catching him off guard. His gaze flicked back to Darren and a flicker of recognition sparked in his mind, slow at first, then growing brighter as fragmented memories clicked into place. His breath hitched, a stammer breaking free as he started, "Wait a second." But before he could finish, Darren raised a hand, his movement steady and deliberate, silencing the younger officer mid-sentence. His dark eyes remained locked on Harper, unwavering, as he spoke in a voice that was quiet, yet carried the weight of a boulder. "I'm this boy's father. That's all you need to know right now." Carter swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he took a small, involuntary step back. His palms grew clammy, the unease now a living thing twisting in his gut. Harper, though, seemed oblivious to the shift in his partner's demeanor. He barreled forward, his voice rising, a hammer striking an anvil. "I don't care who you are. This is my scene, and I'll handle it how I damn well please." His arrogance filled the space like smoke, thick and suffocating, but Darren didn't flinch. His silence was a wall, impenetrable and resolute, standing firm against Harper's bluster. The small crowd that had gathered, locals pausing on their way to the gas station's flickering neon-lit convenience store, watched with wide eyes, their breaths held as if waiting for lightning to strike. Malik shifted in his seat, his sneakers scuffing against the car's floorboard. His hands clutched a worn sketchbook, its edges frayed from countless hours of use. Fear danced in his eyes, wide and glassy, but beneath it flickered something else, a fragile glimmer of hope as he glanced up at his father. Darren's presence was a lifeline, a quiet promise that the chaos swirling around them wouldn't swallow him whole. The air crackled with tension, heavy with unspoken truths that hung like storm clouds on the horizon. Every pair of eyes, Carter's, the crowd's, Malik's, fixed on Darren, waiting for the next move from this man whose stillness seemed to hold more power than Harper's loudest shouts. For a fleeting moment, Harper's smirk wavered. A shadow of doubt crossed his face, so quick it might have been missed if not for the way his jaw tightened immediately after. Darren's words, sparse as they were, had landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the officer's bravado. The parking lot grew quieter, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that pressed down on your chest, the kind that warned of something massive lurking just out of sight. Darren stood tall, his hand resting lightly on Malik's shoulder, a gesture both protective and grounding. Harper's voice cut through again, louder now, as if volume could reclaim the control he felt slipping. "You think you can waltz in here and play the hero? You're nothing but a loud-mouthed dad sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." Darren's response came soft but piercing, slicing through Harper's bluster like a knife through cloth. "This isn't about police work. This is about you stepping over a line you had no business even approaching." Harper scoffed, his laugh a harsh, grating bark that echoed off the gas pumps. "Oh, is that right? You think you're gonna lecture me? You're just another guy who doesn't get how things work out here. I'm the one in charge, not you, not your kid." His finger jabbed toward Malik, who flinched, his knuckles whitening around his sketchbook. Darren's hand tightened briefly on his son's arm, a silent reassurance before he murmured without breaking eye contact with Harper, "It's okay, Malik, just stay close." Harper's laughter erupted again, sharp and cruel, cutting through the thickening tension. "Stay close? What, you think you're protecting him from me? I'm doing my job here. Maybe if you'd taught your kid some respect, he wouldn't be in this mess." The words landed like a slap, and the crowd stirred, a ripple of discomfort passing through them. Darren's eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind his calm facade. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice still measured but now edged with steel. My son doesn't need to learn respect from someone like you. And if you understood what that uniform means, you'd know respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Harper bristled, his face flushing red as his hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching with restless energy. You don't get to stand there and talk to me like that. You don't even know who you're dealing with. Darren's expression didn't shift, but a glint flashed in his eyes, sharp, unyielding, and enough to make Harper falter for a heartbeat. Carter, watching from the sidelines, edged closer, his voice trembling slightly as he ventured, "Harper, maybe we should take a step back. I think—" Harper whirled on him, his frustration exploding. "Quiet, Carter. I don't need your input. I've got this under control." But control was a thread unraveling fast, and everyone could see it. The crowd's murmurs grew softer, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Darren tilted his head, his voice calm but deliberate, each word a carefully placed stone. "Do you, Officer Harper? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've lost it entirely." Harper's jaw clenched, his confidence cracking like thin ice underfoot. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he barked, his voice rising in pitch. "I've been doing this job for years. I know trouble when I see it." Darren stepped closer, his presence filling the space not with noise or force, but with an unshakable gravity. "Do you? Because all I see is a man so drunk on his own arrogance that he doesn't even feel the ground giving way beneath him." Carter shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing the pavement as he cleared his throat. "Harper, listen. I think we should call this in. Get a supervisor down here." Harper spun on him, fury blazing in his eyes. "Are you serious? I don't need a supervisor to handle this. This guy thinks he's untouchable, and I'm not letting him walk away like nothing happened." The words lingered, bitter and heavy, charging the air with a new layer of tension. Darren exhaled slowly, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum. "Untouchable? No, Officer Harper. I'm not untouchable. But you're about to learn what accountability feels like." Harper blinked, a ripple of unease washing over him as Darren's tone shifted. Still calm, but now carrying an edge that cut deeper than any shout. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a car door creaking open sliced through the moment. Darren turned, his movements smooth and deliberate, reaching into the SUV's passenger seat. When he straightened, a sleek black badge case rested in his hand. Harper's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" Darren flipped the case open with a practiced flick, revealing a gleaming badge that caught the fading sunlight. His voice remained steady, but it now carried the full weight of his authority. "Chief Darren Carter, head of the police department, your boss." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, a sharp intake of breath that seemed to shake the earth beneath them. Harper's face drained of color, his arrogance dissolving like mist in the morning sun. His mind raced, scrambling to catch up as he stammered, What? Darren stepped closer, his badge still held aloft, his expression unrelenting. "You didn't bother to ask, did you? You were so busy flexing your authority that you never stopped to think who you were dealing with. Let me make it clear, Officer Harper. You just assaulted the son of your commanding officer." Harper stumbled back, his hand falling limp from his belt as panic clawed its way into his voice. This can't be real. You're lying." Carter's eyes widened, recognition now fully dawning as he muttered, "He's not lying, Harper. I've seen him before. That's Chief Carter." Darren didn't wait for Harper to recover. He advanced again, his voice a quiet blade. "You've spent your career hiding behind that badge, using it as a shield to excuse behavior that has no place in this department. Today you crossed a line you can't walk back from." Harper's hands trembled, his bravado crumbling as he groped for words. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. I didn't mean—" Darren cut him off, his tone firm and final. "You didn't mean to? That's the problem, Harper. You didn't think. You didn't care. And that's why this ends now." The crowd stood frozen, the weight of justice settling over the scene like a storm breaking. Malik looked up at his father, his fear giving way to awe. Carter, still reeling, glanced between the two men, his own role in this moment suddenly small and uncertain. Harper, stripped bare of his bluster, faced a reckoning he'd never seen coming, a lesson in power, pride, and the consequences that follow when they're wielded without care. The parking lot, once just a backdrop, now felt like a stage where the threads of fate had unraveled, leaving everyone changed in their wake. The air in the parking lot hung heavy with tension as the crowd stood rooted to the spot, their phones trembling slightly in their hands, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. The confrontation had reached its boiling point, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Harper, once a towering figure of unshakable confidence, now seemed to shrink before their eyes, his bravado evaporating like mist under the harsh glare of truth. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, and his wide eyes darted frantically, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Darren, on the other hand, radiated a quiet, unshakable authority that filled the space around him, a force not of muscle but of righteousness. He stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes locked on Harper with an intensity that made the air feel colder. The crowd could sense it. This was no ordinary reckoning. This was justice, raw and unfiltered, descending with the weight of inevitability. Harper's fall wasn't just beginning. It was hurtling toward him like a runaway train, and he knew it. His face, once a mask of smug certainty, had transformed into a chaotic swirl of disbelief and dread. Sweat glistened on his forehead, catching the dim light of the street lamps, while his lips twitched as if struggling to form words that might save him. Darren's voice rolled over him like a storm cloud, steady and unrelenting, each syllable a hammer striking the fragile remains of Harper's pride. The crowd remained frozen, their breaths caught in their throats, their eyes flicking between the two men, one a crumbling wreck, the other an immovable pillar of resolve. Phones stayed raised, lenses glinting as they recorded the moment that would soon ripple far beyond this asphalt battleground. Beside Darren stood Malik, his young frame dwarfed by the gravity of the scene. His wide eyes shimmered with a tangled mix of awe, fear, and confusion, his small hands clutching a worn sketchbook as if it were a lifeline. The boy's dark hair fell messily over his forehead, and his lips parted slightly, betraying the whirlwind of emotions churning inside him. He didn't fully understand the scope of what was happening, but he felt it. The shift in power, the weight of his father's presence, the way the world seemed to bend around Darren's quiet fury. Malik's heart raced, his chest tight with the memory of Harper's earlier aggression, the way the officer had loomed over him, barking orders and snatching away his sense of safety. Now, though, his father stood as a shield, and Malik's fear began to mingle with a fragile spark of pride. Harper's voice broke the silence, quivering like a cracked bell as he scrambled to claw back some semblance of control. "Chief Carter, I didn't know it was you. If I'd known—" His words stumbled over each other, weak and disjointed, a desperate plea dressed up as an excuse. But Darren cut him off, his tone sharp as a blade, slicing through Harper's flimsy defense. "You didn't know because you didn't care to find out. You didn't ask. You didn't hesitate. All you saw was my son, a boy sitting in a car, and you decided that was enough to justify your cruelty. You humiliated him, assaulted him in front of all these people. Tell me, Harper, where's the honor in that?" Harper's mouth gaped open, then snapped shut, his jaw trembling as he groped for a response. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling into fists and then releasing, as if he could physically grasp some shred of authority he'd already lost. "It wasn't like that," he stammered, his voice rising with a frantic edge. I thought he was—" Darren's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a chilling whisper, each word laced with ice. "You thought you had power. You thought you could act without consequence because you've done it before, haven't you? You've hidden behind that badge, betting no one would dare call you out. But today, that ends." Nearby, the younger officer, a wiry figure with a mop of sandy hair and a uniform that seemed too big for his lanky frame, shifted uneasily on his feet. His face had gone pale, the color draining from his freckled cheeks as Darren's gaze briefly flickered toward him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and his hands fidgeted with the edge of his belt. "Chief, I tried to step in," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told him we should back off, but he wouldn't listen." Darren raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture, though his eyes never softened. "Enough. This isn't about you right now, but don't fool yourself into thinking your silence makes you innocent. You had a choice to stop this, and you let it happen. That's on you." The younger officer's head dipped, his shoulders slumping as shame carved deep lines into his boyish features. He stared at the cracked pavement, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd or the piercing stare of his chief. His fingers tightened around the radio clipped to his chest, a lifeline he wasn't yet brave enough to use. Meanwhile, Harper's desperation surged, his voice cracking as he gestured wildly toward Darren. "Look, I'll admit it, I messed up. But you've got to understand, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just doing my job." The words tumbled out in a rush, his hands shaking visibly now, betraying the panic clawing at his insides. Darren's response came not as a shout, but as a quiet, bitter laugh, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice through the air and land like a dagger in Harper's chest. "Your job," he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your job is to protect people, to serve them, not to wield your badge like a club against the innocent. My son was sitting in our car, sketching in his book lost in his own world. A boy with a pencil and paper. And you saw a threat? Tell me, Harper, what part of your training taught you to fear a child's imagination?" Harper flinched as if struck, his body recoiling from the question. His eyes darted around the crowd, meeting a sea of accusing stares, some furious, others simply stunned. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket woven from whispers and murmurs that grew louder with every passing second. His breath hitched, and he stammered again. "Chief, I didn't know, I didn't think—" Darren's voice cut through the babble like a gunshot. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You didn't question. You didn't care about the consequences, but now you'll face them." The color drained from Harper's face, leaving him ashen and hollow. He took a shaky step back, his boots scuffing against the pavement, his once proud posture crumbling into something small and pitiful. "Look, I'll cooperate," he pleaded, his voice rising in pitch. "I'll apologize to your son. We don't need to blow this up bigger than it is." His eyes flicked toward Malik, a last-ditch attempt at redemption, but before he could say more, the boy's voice, small but steady, pierced the air. "You think saying sorry fixes it?" Malik asked, stepping forward slightly, his sketchbook clutched tighter now. "You made me feel like I was nothing, like I didn't belong in my own car. How's an apology supposed to change that?" Harper turned toward him, his expression flickering with something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the fear of being caught. But Darren moved swiftly, placing himself between them, his broad frame a wall of protection. "Don't you dare speak to him," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "My son doesn't need your hollow words. What he needs, what he deserves, is to see that men like you don't get to walk away from this, that there's a price for abusing power." The crowd's murmur swelled into a roar, emboldened by Darren's resolve. More phones lifted into the air, their tiny lights blinking like stars against the darkening sky, preserving every word, every gesture. Harper's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in jagged bursts as the reality sank in. This wasn't going to fade quietly. "Chief Carter, please," he begged, his voice cracking like dry twigs. "We can handle this internally. There's no need to escalate." Darren stepped closer, his shadow falling over Harper like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. "Internally?" he echoed, his tone icy with contempt. "You think I'll let you slink back to that precinct and sweep this under the rug? No, Harper. This ends here, today." Harper's knees seemed to buckle slightly, his bravado shattered beyond repair. "I've been on the force for years," he tried one last time, his voice a ragged whisper. I've done good work. One mistake doesn't define me. Darren's gaze hardened, his eyes glinting with the steel of a man who'd seen too much injustice to let this slide. It's not one mistake, he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of truth. It's a pattern. A trail of arrogance and abuse you've left behind you, thinking that uniform made you untouchable. But today, you showed everyone here what you really are, and it's not a man worthy of that badge. The younger officer, spurred into action at last, stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. Chief, what do you want us to do? How do we fix this? Darren turned to him, his expression softening just a fraction, though his resolve remained ironclad. You call it in, he said simply. You follow protocol. You document every detail, no shortcuts, no cover-ups. That's how this gets handled. The younger officer nodded quickly, fumbling with his radio as his shaking hands betrayed his nerves. Yes, sir, he muttered, pressing the button and speaking in a halting voice, summoning a supervisor and internal affairs. Harper's face twisted in a final surge of desperation. Wait, he shouted, lunging toward the younger officer as if he could stop the call with his bare hands. You don't have to do this! You don't know what this'll do to me! Darren's response was a blade of ice, cutting through Harper's plea with surgical precision. What it'll do to you! My son will carry the scar of this day for years, maybe forever. You'll face the consequences of what you've done, and you'll finally understand what it means to be held accountable. That's not punishment, Harper. That's justice. As the younger officer's voice crackled over the radio, the crowd erupted, their cheers rising like a wave crashing over the scene. They clapped and shouted, their voices a chorus of support for Darren and Malik, a collective release of the tension that had gripped them. Harper stood motionless, a broken figure in the center of the storm, his world collapsing around him brick by brick. His uniform, once a symbol of power, now hung on him like a shroud, marking him not as a protector, but as a man undone by his own hubris. Darren turned to Malik, his stern features softening as he rested a steady hand on his son's shoulder. It's over, Malik, he said, his voice warm now, a balm against the chaos. You're safe. Malik looked up at him, his dark eyes glistening with tears he fought to hold back. Thank you, Dad, he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. Darren's hand tightened gently, his gaze lingering on his son with a mix of pride and sorrow. No, son, he replied, his tone steady and full of purpose. Thank you for reminding me why I fight for this. For you and for everyone who deserves better than what he tried to take from you. The parking lot buzzed with an electric charge, the air thick with the weight of justice finally served. Harper's silence was deafening, his once commanding presence reduced to a hollow shell, stripped bare of the authority he'd abused. The reckoning had arrived, swift and unyielding, but its echoes would stretch far beyond this moment, a resounding lesson carved into the night that power without accountability is a fragile illusion, destined to shatter under the light of truth. The crowd lingered, their phones still recording, their voices still murmuring, bearing witness to a promise kept. That justice, when it comes, spares no one who dares to trample on the innocent. In that fleeting, fragile moment, he stood bare and defenseless, stripped of the armor he'd worn so arrogantly for years. The air around him thickened with tension as he parted his lips, desperate to say something, anything, to claw his way out of the suffocating silence. But no sound emerged. The crushing weight of Darren's words bore down on him, mingling with the piercing stares of the onlookers and the grim certainty of what lay ahead. His voice, once sharp with authority, had abandoned him, leaving him stranded in a sea of his own reckoning. Nearby, the younger officer fumbled with his radio, its static crackling faintly as he lowered it to his side. He turned to Darren, his face a tangled mess of admiration and unease, the lines of his brow deepening as he spoke. Chief, I've radioed internal affairs and the duty supervisor. They're on their way to take over. Should I do anything else for you right now? His voice trembled slightly, betraying the nerves that danced beneath his composed exterior. Darren didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained locked on Harper, studying the man as though he could see straight through to the rotten core beneath the badge. After a long, deliberate pause, he shifted his gaze to the younger officer, his tone steady and resolute. "You've done what's right by calling this in. Now I need you to write it all down. Every word spoken, every move made. Leave nothing out. We're not burying this under excuses or half-truths." The officer gave a quick, jerky nod, his fingers trembling as he fished a worn notepad from his pocket. He flipped it open with a flick of his wrist and began scribbling furiously, the scratch of his pen against the paper a faint but determined sound in the stillness. Darren's voice softened, just a touch, as he added, "And when they arrive, make it clear this isn't some isolated mistake. This is a pattern, a sickness that doesn't belong in our ranks." At those words, Harper flinched as though struck, his body recoiling inward. His voice finally clawed its way free, hoarse and pleading, cutting through the heavy air. "Chief Carter, please, don't do this. Don't torch my whole career over one slip-up." The desperation in his tone was raw, almost pitiful, but it did nothing to soften the steel in Darren's gaze. His eyes snapped back to Harper, blazing with an intensity that pinned the man where he stood. "Ruin your career?" Darren's voice was low, sharp, each word a hammer striking stone. "You did that yourself the second you decided your badge was a free pass to degrade and hurt people. This isn't about me, Harper. It's about the trust you've shattered, not just with my family, but with every soul you've ever treated like dirt beneath your boots." The crowd stirred restlessly at Darren's words, a ripple of murmured agreement spreading through them like wildfire. Phones stayed raised, their lenses drinking in every second of the unraveling scene, preserving it for a world beyond this dusty parking lot. Malik edged closer to his father, his small frame dwarfed by the tension swirling around them. His voice was soft, steady despite the tremor in his hands as he whispered, "Does this mean he can't hurt anyone else?" Darren glanced down at his son, and for a fleeting moment the hard lines of his face softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through the storm in his eyes. "That's what we're aiming for, Malik, to hold people like him accountable so no one else has to feel what you did today." Malik nodded slowly, his fingers loosening their death grip on the sketchbook he'd been clutching like a lifeline. A faint glimmer of relief sparked in his dark eyes, though it wrestled with the shadows of fear and shame still etched into his young face. Darren rested a steady hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him, before turning his attention back to Harper. "You think this is just about you," he said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "But it's bigger than that. It's about the community you swore to protect, the people you failed over and over. And it's about stopping that failure right here, right now." Harper's hands balled into fists at his sides, his knuckles whitening as his voice rose in a frantic last-ditch plea. "I've done good things for this department. I've risked my life out there. Doesn't that mean anything?" His words hung in the air, brittle and hollow, as the crowd watched in hushed anticipation. Darren's expression didn't budge, his resolve carved from stone. "Doing your job doesn't erase the times you abused your power. Being a cop isn't about medals or glory. It's about serving people. Every time you let your pride and prejudice steer you, you spat on that duty." The younger officer paused his frantic note-taking, his pen hovering over the page as he wrestled with something inside himself. Finally, he looked up, his voice tentative but firm. "Chief, if I can say something, I've seen him do things that didn't sit right with me. I kept quiet before, figured it wasn't my place to speak up. But now—" He trailed off, guilt flickering in his eyes. Darren turned to him, his tone softening just enough to offer encouragement. "Now's your chance. If you've witnessed wrongdoing and stayed silent because you were scared of the fallout, this is the moment to step up. No one should feel helpless to do what's right." The officer straightened, a newfound determination hardening his features as he nodded. "I'll put it all in my report, sir. Every damn thing." The distant wail of sirens sliced through the quiet, growing louder as the crowd shifted uneasily. Some began to drift away, their curiosity sated, while others lingered, rooted by the drama unfolding before them. Harper's face drained of what little color remained, his eyes darting toward the sound as the reality of his fate crashed over him like a tidal wave. Darren turned to Malik, his voice low but firm. "Go wait in the car, son. You don't need to watch what comes next." Malik hesitated, his gaze bouncing between his father and the restless onlookers. "You sure?" he asked, his voice small. Darren nodded, unwavering. "I'm sure. I'll be there soon." Reluctantly, Malik shuffled toward the SUV, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. He climbed into the back seat, pulling the door shut with a soft thud, and settled in, his sketchbook resting on his lap as he stared out the tinted window. The sirens swelled, and soon a supervisor's cruiser rolled into the lot, followed by an unmarked car bearing the stern weight of internal affairs. Uniformed officers spilled out, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. A woman strode forward, her presence commanding despite her unassuming stature, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Chief Carter," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "We got a call about an incident with one of our own." Darren met her gaze, his tone even but heavy with intent. "You did. I've told the reporting officer to log every detail. You'll find witness accounts and video evidence aplenty." The internal affairs officers exchanged a quick, knowing glance before moving toward Harper, who seemed to shrink further under their scrutiny, his bravado crumbling into dust. As the officers set to work, Darren stood unwavering, a pillar amid the chaos. The crowd thinned further, their whispers fading into the evening breeze as the sun dipped low, painting the lot in long, jagged shadows. Darren exhaled slowly, the burden of the day pressing against his chest, yet a quiet resolve settled over him. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a stride toward justice, a hard-won step toward righting a wrong that had festered too long. For now, that was enough. The parking lot, once buzzing with tension, now lay mostly empty, though an invisible weight still hung in the air, thick and unyielding. A handful of stragglers remained, their curiosity tethering them to the scene like moths to a flame. Darren stood off to the side, his shoulders squared, his calm exterior a stark contrast to the storm that had just raged through. The internal affairs team moved with practiced efficiency, their dark suits and clipped voices a jarring intrusion against the fading daylight. They'd already collected statements, confiscated Harper's badge and service weapon, and begun piecing together the damning mosaic of his actions. Harper himself stood a short distance away, a broken figure, his shoulders hunched, his face ashen, a far cry from the barking, self-assured man he'd been mere minutes ago. His hands twitched at his sides as though searching for something to hold on to, some shred of the power he'd once wielded so carelessly. Inside the SUV, Malik sat curled up in the back seat, his knees drawn close to his chest. His sketchbook lay open on his lap, its edges worn from his restless grip. His fingers traced idle, looping patterns along the corners of the pages, a mindless ritual to steady his racing thoughts. His mind churned with the day's events, the harsh words, the looming threat, the way his father had stepped in like a shield. Relief flickered faintly within him, a fragile ember struggling against the lingering sting of fear and humiliation. Every so often, he'd steal a glance at Darren through the window, marveling at the man who could be both the gentle dad who puzzled over algebra with him and the unyielding force now commanding the scene outside. It was a duality Malik couldn't quite grasp, but it steadied him all the same. Darren caught his son's eye for a brief moment, and the hard edges of his face softened, a silent promise passing between them. "I've got you." Then he turned back to the officers, his posture resolute. A tall, broad-shouldered agent approached, his beard neatly trimmed, his voice low and deliberate, honed by years of navigating messes like this. "Chief Carter, we've wrapped up the initial steps. Witness statements are in. Footage has been reviewed. What we've got so far, it's more than enough to launch a full investigation. Harper's off duty, effective immediately, and he won't be back anytime soon." The agent's tone was calm, final, carrying the weight of inevitability. Darren gave a single, measured nod, his face betraying nothing. Good. Make it thorough. I want every stone turned, every detail accounted for. The lesson here stretched far beyond Harper's fall. It was a stark reminder of justice's slow but unrelenting grind and the ruin that follows when power is twisted into a weapon. For Darren, it was a vow fulfilled, a line drawn in the sand. For Malik, it was a fragile hope taking root, that the world could be made right, one hard step at a time. And for the younger officer, scribbling his truth into that notepad, it was a awakening, a call to stand tall against the shadows he'd once ignored. As the sun sank lower, casting the lot in a twilight glow, the echoes of this day lingered, a testament to the cost of betrayal and the quiet strength required to face it head-on. Every word, every fleeting gesture, every subtle shift in the air, it was all meticulously recorded, etched into the fabric of that tense afternoon. Nothing could slip through the cracks, not under the watchful eyes of the internal affairs team swarming the gas station lot like ants on a mission. The agent, a wiry man with a clipboard clutched tight, paused mid-sentence as he addressed Darren. His tone, usually clipped and mechanical, softened ever so slightly, a trace of something like reverence threading through his words. You've got my word, Chief. We'll handle this by the book, clean, thorough, no shortcuts. And if I can say so, it's not every day you see someone in your shoes take a stand like this, especially against one of your own. That takes guts. His eyes flicked up from his notes, catching Darren's steady gaze, searching for a reaction. Darren didn't flinch. He stood there, broad-shouldered and unshaken, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his weathered face. His voice came low and even, but there was a hardness beneath it, like tempered steel glinting through calm waters. It shouldn't take guts. This isn't some grand act of heroism. It's the bare minimum. It's what we're all supposed to do, every single one of us who wears this badge. Fall short of that and we're not just failing ourselves. We're spitting in the face of the people we swore to protect. His words hung heavy, unyielding, a quiet rebuke to a system that too often bent under the weight of its own flaws. The agent's lips twitched, a faint spark of admiration lighting his otherwise guarded expression, before he dipped his head in a curt nod and stepped back to resume his work, clipboard snapping shut with a decisive click. Darren let out a slow, measured breath, the tension easing from his chest for just a moment. His sharp eyes shifted across the cracked asphalt to Harper, who lingered a few yards away, a pitiful figure against the backdrop of flashing lights and murmured voices. The man who'd been all bluster and bravado earlier now looked like a hollow shell of himself. His shoulders sagged under an invisible burden, his hands twitching nervously at his sides, fingers knotting and unknotting as if trying to grasp something solid in the chaos. Harper's face was ashen, drained of color, his darting eyes bouncing between the internal affairs team, the gathering crowd of onlookers, and Darren himself, like a trapped animal scanning for an exit that didn't exist. When he finally spoke, his voice quivered, a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. Chief Carter, I know I screwed up. I know I didn't handle it right. But come on, do you really think I deserve to lose everything over this? My career, my life, everything? Darren moved toward him with deliberate steps, his boots scuffing softly against the pavement. His posture remained composed, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he carried himself, a weight that seemed to press the air around them. When he spoke, his voice was steady, each word chosen with care, laced with the authority of a man who'd seen too much to mince words. You're missing the point, Harper. This isn't about what you think you're entitled to. It's not about your feelings or your excuses. It's about the damage you've done, the trust you've shattered. Not just with me, but with every single person you've wronged while hiding behind that badge you wear. Every life you've disrupted because you thought your power gave you the right. Harper's hands balled into feeble fists, knuckles whitening as he struggled to muster a defense. His voice rose, thin and unsteady, grasping at straws. I didn't mean for it to turn out like this. I was just trying to do my job, Chief. Darren's response cut through the air like a blade, swift and unsparing. Your job? Your job is to serve this community, to protect it, to hold up the values we're supposed to stand for, to be a force for good, not fear. And what did you do today? You saw a kid, my kid, sitting quietly in a car, sketching in his notebook, and you decided he was a threat. You didn't stop to think. You didn't ask a single question. You just acted, blind and reckless, with no regard for who you were hurting. So don't stand there and tell me that's doing your job. Explain to me how that's anything close to what you swore to uphold. Harper's mouth opened, a weak protest forming on his lips, but the weight of Darren's words seemed to choke it off before it could take shape. His shoulders slumped further, his head bowing as his gaze dropped to the scuffed toes of his boots, the fight draining out of him like water through cracked earth. Darren took another step closer, his voice dipping slightly, softening but still edged with resolve. This isn't just about today, Harper. This is about every time you've let your prejudices call the shots. Every time you've flexed your authority because you figured no one would dare call you out. Well, that ends now. Today, you answer for it. Harper's head jerked up, his face twisting with a desperate plea, eyes wide and glassy. But I've done good too. I've risked my neck for this department. Doesn't that mean anything? Darren's expression remained stone cold, unflinching. Good deeds don't wipe the slate clean, Harper. You don't get to cherry-pick when you live up to your oath. And you sure as hell don't get to beg for mercy without owning up to the wreckage you've left behind. Harper's voice broke, a raw, ragged sound as he tried one last time. I didn't mean for it to spiral like this, I swear. Darren cut him off, his tone dropping to a near whisper, heavy with a sorrowful finality. Intentions don't undo the harm. What matters is that it happened. And now you face what comes next. You might not have wanted this, but you caused it. Time to own it. The words landed like a gavel, leaving Harper speechless, his chest heaving as he stared blankly at the ground. From the sidelines, a younger officer, a lanky kid with a mop of dark hair and a nervous twitch in his jaw, shifted uncomfortably, his boots scraping against the pavement. He'd been silent through the whole exchange, hovering just out of the spotlight. But now he cleared his throat and stepped forward, hesitant but determined. Chief Carter, he began, his voice shaky but resolute, I just want you to know. I'm putting it all in my report. Everything. There were times before this. Things Harper did that didn't sit right with me. I kept my mouth shut then, figured it wasn't my place. But I'm done staying quiet. I'll tell it straight. Darren turned to him, his stern gaze softening just a fraction, a flicker of approval breaking through. It's not easy to speak up, especially in this job. Takes more spine than most have. If you mean that, if you're serious about setting things right, then don't hold back. Make that report airtight. This isn't just about Harper, it's about rooting out a sickness that's festered too long in this department. The younger officer straightened, his jaw tightening with a newfound resolve. Yes, sir. You can count on it. He gave a firm nod, then stepped back, clutching his notepad like a lifeline as the internal affairs team began wrapping up their work, their voices a low hum against the distant wail of approaching sirens. Darren's attention shifted to the SUV parked a few feet away, where Malik sat hunched in the back seat, his small frame pressed against the window. The boy's eyes flicked nervously toward his father as Darren approached, the weight of the day etched into every line of his young face. When Darren opened the door, Malik's voice slipped out, soft and tentative, barely above a whisper. Is it really over? Darren paused, crouching slightly to meet his son's gaze. His hand found Malik's shoulder, warm and steady, and his voice softened into something gentle yet firm. Not yet, kid, but we're moving the needle. It's a start. Malik hesitated, his wide eyes searching his father's face, a storm of questions brewing behind them. Do you think he'll ever change? Darren sighed, a slow, heavy sound, his gaze drifting thoughtfully toward the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold. That's on him, Malik. Change isn't easy, It takes guts, and it takes owning up to your mistakes. But whether he turns himself around or not, that's not the point. What matters is holding people like him accountable, making sure justice doesn't just sit on the sidelines. That's how we build something better. Malik nodded faintly, his grip on his sketchbook loosening as the tension in his small hands began to ebb. Darren gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before sliding into the driver's seat, the SUV rumbling to life as they pulled away from the gas station. The scene shrank in the rearview mirror. The flashing lights, the milling figures, the concrete lot stained with years of spilled oil and regret. Darren's eyes lingered on it for a heartbeat longer, the weight of the day settling deep into his bones. Exhaustion tugged at him, but beneath it burned a quiet fire, a resolve that refused to flicker out. Justice had taken a step forward today, a small but unshakable victory in a fight that stretched far beyond this single moment. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but it was enough to keep going. As the SUV rolled through the city streets, Malik sat silently in the back, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. The tension from the gas station clung to him like a second skin, a tight coil in his chest that refused to fully unwind. The familiar blur of storefronts and streetlights streaked past, but his mind was still trapped in that lot, replaying the fear, the anger, the helplessness. Darren caught his son's reflection in the mirror, the boy's silence louder than any words. He could sense the questions piling up, heavy and unspoken, pressing against the quiet between them. "Malik," Darren said at last, his voice a low, steady anchor in the stillness. "I know today threw a lot at you. If there's anything rattling around in that head of yours, anything you need to get out, I'm right here." Malik didn't answer right away, his eyes still tracing the passing world outside. After a long, heavy pause, he shifted slightly, his voice emerging small but thick with feeling. "Why does it have to be like this? Why do people like him think they can just treat us that way?" Darren's hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles flexing briefly before he exhaled, slow and deliberate. His tone was careful, measured, but threaded with a raw honesty. "There's no clean answer to that, son. Some folks carry fear in their hearts, or hate, or both, and they let it steer them. They see someone like you, or me, and they don't see a person. They see whatever story they've already told themselves. It's wrong and it cuts deep, but it's the truth we're up against. The real trick is not letting it break you down." Malik frowned, his brows knitting together as he hugged his sketchbook tighter, the edges digging into his chest. "But it did break me. For a little bit it did. I felt so small, Dad." The words hit Darren like a punch, his son's quiet admission slicing through him sharper than any blade. He eased the SUV into an empty lot off the main road, the engine idling as he shifted to face Malik fully. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice softening but firm, his eyes locking onto his son's. "What happened back there? That wasn't on you. You didn't do a damn thing wrong. That officer tried to strip you down, make you feel like nothing, but he didn't win. You're still here, still you, and that's stronger than he'll ever be." Malik's eyes shimmered, tears threatening to spill as his voice wavered. "But what if it happens again? What if next time it's worse?" Darren leaned in, closing the distance between them, his gaze steady and fierce. "That's why we push back, Malik. That's why we stand tall and make damn sure people like him face the music, so there's less room for next times. So the world gets a little safer, a little fairer, for you and everyone else who's been on the wrong end of that kind of power. Justice isn't just a word, it's a fight, and we don't stop fighting." His words carried the weight of a promise, a vow forged in the fire of that day, and as Malik met his father's eyes, a flicker of strength sparked beneath the fear, a small, stubborn ember that refused to be snuffed out. Malik tilted his head in a slow, deliberate nod, but the shadow of uncertainty lingered in his wide, searching eyes, refusing to let go completely. Darren, sensing the unspoken weight his son carried, reached out with a steady hand and rested it gently on Malik's shoulder. The warmth of his touch was a quiet promise. "You're not facing this by yourself, you know," he said, his voice firm yet tender. "You've got me right here with you. You've got your mom, always in your corner, and there's a whole community out there that's got your back. Together, Malik, we're unstoppable, strong enough to take on anything that comes our way." His words hung in the air, a lifeline extended to his son's troubled heart. Malik's gaze drifted downward to the sketchbook cradled in his lap. His fingers, hesitant yet reverent, traced the edges of a drawing etched into the worn cover, a jagged, bold design that seemed to pulse with his restless energy. When he spoke again, his voice was so soft it barely broke the silence, a fragile thread of sound. "Do you think he regrets it, Dad? That officer? Do you think he feels sorry?" The question trembled with a mix of hope and doubt, as though Malik were peering into a storm cloud, searching for a glimpse of light. Darren paused, his brow furrowing as he weighed the question with the care it deserved. He leaned back slightly, his hand still resting on Malik's shoulder, grounding them both. "Maybe he does, in his own twisted way," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe he's more sorry he got caught than for what he did, trapped by his own ego. Or maybe, just maybe, he's starting to see the wreckage he left behind, the pain he carved into people's lives. But here's the thing, Malik. Regret's just a feeling. It's a hollow word unless it leads to something real. What matters is what he does with it, how he owns up to it. That's where justice starts to take root." His tone carried a quiet gravity, a lesson woven into every syllable. Malik's face softened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he mulled over his father's words. The storm in his eyes seemed to settle, if only a little, replaced by a flicker of contemplation. Darren caught the shift and offered a small, encouraging smile, a beacon of reassurance, before turning his attention back to the steering wheel. With a gentle twist of the key, the engine hummed to life, and he eased the car out of the gas station parking lot, the gravel crunching beneath the tires like a fading echo of the day's tension. The drive home stretched out in silence, but it wasn't the suffocating quiet that had cloaked them earlier. This was different, softer, lighter. Malik sat straighter now, his shoulders less hunched, as though the conversation had chipped away at the burden pressing down on him. When they pulled into the driveway, the familiar silhouette of their house emerged against the dusky sky, its windows glowing with a warm, golden light. Malik climbed out of the car, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he trailed behind his father to the front door. Stepping inside, they were enveloped by the comforting embrace of home, the faint scent of wood polish mingling with the rich, savory promise of lasagna Darren had vowed to whip up that night. Malik let his sketchbook slip onto the coffee table with a soft thud and sank into the couch, his body melting into the cushions. His eyes drifted to some distant point beyond the room, calmer now, though still tinged with the day's lingering echoes. Darren moved into the kitchen with the ease of a man who'd danced this routine 100 times before. He pulled ingredients from the fridge, bright red tomatoes, a block of creamy mozzarella, a bundle of fragrant basil, his hands working with a steady rhythm that anchored him. The sharp chop of the knife against the cutting board became a metronome, slicing through the chaos of the day and tethering him to the present. From the living room, Malik's voice floated in, tentative but curious. "Dad, do you think people can really change? Like, deep down, even if they've done awful things?" The question stopped Darren mid-chop, the knife hovering above a half-sliced onion. He turned slowly, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and met his son's gaze across the room. "I think they can," he said, his voice measured but hopeful. "But it's not a simple thing, Malik. It's a battle, harder than most people realize. They've got to stare down the ugliest parts of themselves, admit what they've done, and then claw their way toward something better. Not everyone's got the guts for that kind of fight." He crossed the room and lowered himself onto the couch beside Malik, the cushions dipping under his weight. "As for that officer, I don't know if he will. That's his road to walk. But what I do know is this. We can't let what he did chain us down. We've got to keep pushing forward no matter how heavy it gets." Malik frowned, his fingers flipping idly through the pages of his sketchbook, the rustle of paper filling the quiet between them. Then, with a small, shaky breath, he looked up. "You're not mad at me, are you? For not saying anything when he yelled at me? I froze." The confession spilled out raw and unguarded, his eyes pleading for understanding. Darren's heart twisted at the words, a sharp pang of protectiveness surging through him. He shook his head firmly, his expression softening. "Malik, no. Never. You've got nothing to feel ashamed about. Freezing up when someone's screaming in your face, it doesn't mean you're weak. It's your mind and body telling you to survive. Fear does that to all of us sometimes. What matters is you're here now, safe, and you held your ground in your own quiet way. That's strength, son." He reached out, ruffling Malik's hair with a gentle hand, the gesture brimming with unspoken pride. Malik's shoulders eased, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Dad," he murmured, the words carrying a fragile warmth. Darren grinned back, the tension in his chest loosening. "Anytime, kiddo. Now, how about you give me a hand with this lasagna? I think we've earned ourselves a proper feast tonight." For the first time that day, Malik's face lit up with a real smile, small but bright, like a crack of sunlight breaking through a storm. It warmed Darren to his core. Together they shuffled into the kitchen, the clatter of pots and the sizzle of sauce drowning out the day's lingering shadows. Darren knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but in this moment, side by side with his son, hands dusted with flour and laughter bubbling up between them, he found a sliver of peace. It was a fragile, precious thing, a reminder of why he'd keep fighting to make the world safer, fairer for Malik. The weeks that followed unfurled like a tempest, sweeping far beyond the cracked asphalt of that gas station parking lot. Internal Affairs descended with a vengeance, launching a sprawling investigation into Officer Harper's actions. What they uncovered wasn't just the ugly confrontation with Malik. It was a festering trail of grievances stretching back years, a litany of complaints from a community long ignored. The evidence piled up, cold and irrefutable, until Harper's resignation came swift and unceremonious. But the scars he'd left behind didn't fade with his badge. For Darren, now chief of police, this was no victory to savor. It was a call to arms. One man's downfall wouldn't mend a broken system. The rot ran deeper, tangled in policies and habits that had shielded men like Harper for too long. He refused to let it stand. With a fire in his gut, Darren rolled out reforms like a man possessed. Mandatory bias training became the first brick in the wall, followed by an independent review board tasked with digging into every complaint, no matter how small. He threw open the department's doors, inviting community leaders to monthly sit-downs, raw, honest talks where voices once silenced could finally be heard. Change didn't come easy. The old guard grumbled, and progress crawled at times. But Darren was relentless, his broad shoulders squared against the pushback, his reputation swelling as a leader who demanded fairness without apology. The community took notice, respect blooming in quiet nods and outstretched hands. For Malik, life stitched itself back together thread by thread, though the memory of that day clung to him like a second skin. His sketchbook, once a playground of wild dreams, now bore the weight of his reality. One page held a towering figure, his father, unmistakable in his steady stance, a shield against the chaos. Another captured the gas station in harsh, angular strokes, the officer's shadow looming like a storm cloud. Malik started sharing his art, first with friends, then beyond, his pencil lines sparking murmurs that grew into conversations. People saw themselves in his drawings, the fear, the anger, the fragile hope. And through them, Malik found a voice, young but resonant, cutting through the noise with a truth he hadn't known he possessed. Meanwhile, Harper's world crumbled into dust. Stripped of his badge and laid bare by his exposed record, he became a ghost in the streets he'd once roamed. Job applications vanished into the void, unanswered. Old buddies turned their backs, their silence louder than any rebuke. Alone in his sparse apartment, The walls seemed to close in, each creak of the floorboards a reminder of what he'd lost. For the first time, Harper faced the mirror of his actions, not out of duty, but because the wreckage of his life demanded it. Counseling became his lifeline, a grueling trek through the arrogance and bias that had fueled his ruin. Could he change? The question lingered, unanswered, but the cracks in his once iron resolve had begun to show. Through it all, Darren and Malik grew tighter, their bond forged anew in the fire of that day. Darren, always a steady presence, doubled down, carving out time to sit with Malik, to listen, to show him he'd never walk alone. One evening, as the kitchen table groaned under the weight of takeout boxes, Malik slid a drawing across to his father. A superhero, cape billowing, victorious, his silhouette a dead ringer for Darren. Laughter rumbled in Darren's chest, rich and warm. "I don't know if I can measure up to that, kid." Malik's eyes sparkled, his grin wide. "You already do, Dad." The community caught the spark, too. Local shops opened their doors for workshops on racial equity, voices rising in unison over coffee and clipboards. Schools rolled out lessons on bias, planting seeds in young minds. Grassroots groups swelled, their roots digging deeper. Darren and Malik showed up together, shaking hands, sharing stories, teaching and learning in equal measure. What started as a single, painful clash had ignited something bigger, a slow, stubborn push for something better. Months later, Darren stood in his office, the city skyline a glittering tapestry beyond the window. His desk was a battlefield of reports, review board findings, scribbled notes from community talks. He leaned back, exhaling a long, tired breath, when his phone buzzed. Malik's name flashed on the screen, the message simple. "Dinner's ready. Don't make me eat alone." A smile broke across Darren's face, weary but full, as he grabbed his coat and headed home. This wasn't just about that day in the parking lot. It was about the aftershocks, the lessons carved into every step forward. Justice wasn't a gavel's bang. It was a promise kept, a system questioned, a father and son standing tall. And in the quiet power of their shared fight, hope took root, whispering of a future worth building. In the stillness of a cold, unforgiving night, the air hung heavy with the weight of neglect and decay. Run-down houses slumped against one another, their peeling paint and shattered windows whispering tales of a neighborhood long forgotten. Empty storefronts lined the streets, their faded signs swaying faintly in the breeze, relics of a time when hope still flickered here. Inside his patrol car, Officer David Brown sat restless, his fingers tapping an impatient rhythm against the steering wheel. The monotony of this shift gnawed at him, each passing minute stretching into an eternity of boredom. To him, this place was a wasteland, a breeding ground for trouble, populated by people he'd written off as lazy, unworthy, and perpetually at fault for their own misery. He didn't see potential for redemption here. He saw only shadows to control, lives to judge. As his cruiser rolled slowly past a shuttered convenience store, its grimy windows reflecting the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, something caught his eye. A figure stood alone near the entrance, barely moving, like a statue carved from the night itself. It was an elderly black woman, her frail frame leaning heavily on a weathered cane. A wide-brimmed hat cast a deep shadow over her face, hiding her features while a plastic bag dangled from her thin, trembling hand. She looked out of place, too fragile, too old to be wandering these streets at this hour. David's chest tightened with a familiar irritation, a spark igniting into something darker. Probably another vagrant, he thought, his mind racing with assumptions he'd honed over years of disdain. A thief, a junkie, someone who doesn't belong. He didn't need evidence. His prejudices filled in the blanks, painting her as a target for his simmering frustration. Without hesitation, he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the cracked pavement as the car lurched to a stop. This was his chance, something to break the night's dull rhythm, a moment to flex the authority that fueled his sense of self. He stepped out, his boots striking the ground with a deliberate, menacing thud, each stride radiating purpose. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even turn to acknowledge him as he approached. That defiance, her refusal to cower, only stoked the fire in his gut. Most people shrank under the weight of his badge, especially here, where his pale skin and uniform carried an unspoken threat. But not her. She stood rooted, unshaken, as if his presence was nothing more than a passing breeze. "Hey!" His voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and commanding. The woman turned her head slowly, almost leisurely, her eyes glinting faintly beneath the brim of her hat. There was no fear in them, no flicker of panic, only a steady, piercing calm that seemed to mock him. "What are you doing out here this late?" he snapped, stepping closer, his tone dripping with accusation. "Looking for something to steal?" He didn't care if she answered. He just wanted her to break, to shrink, to give him the reaction he craved. But she didn't. Her brow furrowed slightly, her gaze locking onto his with an icy resolve that made his skin prickle. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she replied, her voice soft but unshakably firm. "I'm just on my way home." The simplicity of her words, delivered without a hint of desperation, felt like a slap to David's pride. "Home?" He sneered, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "People like you don't just go home this late." His eyes flashed with contempt as he reached out and snatched the plastic bag from her grip. It tore slightly, spilling a few boxes of food, cereal, a can of soup, onto the pavement. She didn't gasp or protest. She just watched him, her silence louder than any scream. That stillness infuriated him. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he roared, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. His pride swelled, a toxic mix of anger and entitlement surging through him. He stepped closer, towering over her, the space between them shrinking under the weight of his aggression. "You know who you're talking to? I'm a cop. I'm the one in charge here." His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot and ragged, but she didn't flinch. Her silence poured fuel on the fire raging inside him, and he raised his hand, ready to shove her, to force her to feel the fear he demanded. But before his hand could connect, a quiet voice broke through the tension. "You don't know what you're doing." The words were soft, almost a whisper, yet they carried a weight that stopped his arm mid-swing. Something shifted in the air, a flicker of doubt piercing through his fury, but it wasn't enough to pull him back. Blinded by rage, he swung his fist, aiming to shatter her calm defiance. Instead of crumpling, she stepped back with surprising agility, her cane steadying her as she straightened. Then, in a motion so deliberate it felt rehearsed, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather wallet. With a flick of her wrist, she flipped it open, revealing a glinting FBI badge under the streetlight's faint glow. "You've made a big mistake, David Brown," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with an authority that chilled him to the bone. "I'm Special Agent Louise Thompson with the FBI, and you're going to pay for this." The words landed like a hammer, each syllable driving the reality deeper into his skull. David froze, his fists still clenched, his breath catching in his throat. The blood drained from his face as panic clawed its way up his spine. An FBI agent? His mind reeled, rejecting the truth even as it stared him down. This can't be real. A black woman, old and frail out here alone? No way. "You've got to be kidding me!" he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of disbelief and fury. "An FBI agent wandering the streets like some beggar?" She didn't fit the picture he'd built in his head, polished suits, stern faces, power that matched his own narrow vision. He stared at her, his hand trembling, rage warring with the first tendrils of fear. Louise stood unwavering, the badge catching the light as she held his gaze. Her eyes seemed to peel back his bravado, exposing the cowardice beneath. "You think I'm joking?" she said, her voice slow and deliberate, each word a quiet blade. "I've been watching you, David. You and your little crew of cops, the racism, the power trips, the abuses. I'm not here by accident. I'm here to bring it all down." Her calm certainty sliced through him, sharper than any insult. She wasn't just a witness. She was a reckoning. "Shut up!" he exploded, his voice a raw, desperate howl. "You think you can ruin me? You, an old black woman, think you can touch me?" The venom in his words dripped with hatred, his anger no longer just about her badge but about her very existence daring to challenge him. He couldn't stand it. The idea that she, someone he'd dismissed as powerless, held the upper hand. His chest heaved, his eyes wild with a fury that bordered on madness. "I don't care who you are. This is my turf. I'll make you pay." He raised his hand again, this time with lethal intent, his body coiled to strike. But her voice cut through once more, colder and more precise than before. "You're playing with fire, David. Do you even know who's watching you right now? They're coming." The words hit him like a punch, sowing confusion into his chaos. "Who?" he bellowed, his voice trembling as fear began to overtake his rage. "Who's watching?" He scanned the empty street, the shadows suddenly feeling alive, pressing in around him. "They've been watching you for months," Louise said, her tone steady as steel. "Every racist slur, every swing of your fist, every dirty power play you and your boys thought you'd get away with, we have it all." Her words tightened around him like a noose, and for the first time, David felt trapped. His bravado crumbled, replaced by a gnawing dread that clawed at his insides. "I don't care about the FBI!" he roared, his face flushed with desperation. "You're nothing! I'll show you real power!" He lunged at her, arms outstretched, determined to reclaim the dominance slipping through his fingers. He needed to see her break, to prove he still ruled this night. But before he could touch her, a sharp noise pierced the air, tires screeching, lights flashing, and the shadows came alive with the weight of justice closing in. David's world tilted, and in that moment, he knew the consequences of his abuse of power had finally caught up with him. Across town, Malik, a young man who'd once lived in this very neighborhood, watched the scene unfold from a hidden vantage point. He'd known Louise for years, a mentor who'd pulled him from the streets and taught him resilience. Her quiet bravery now mirrored his own journey, standing firm against fear and injustice, carving a path to something better. Darren, a fellow agent shadowing her that night, gripped his radio, his calm resolve steadying the team as they moved in. Together, they embodied a lesson David would learn too late. True strength lies not in domination, but in the courage to uphold what's right. The fall of a corrupt system began with this single, unshakable act, a testament to the enduring power of integrity over tyranny. Under the faint glow of flickering streetlights, David turned his head, his pulse quickening as he caught sight of two sleek black SUVs rolling silently to a stop behind him. The air grew thick with tension as the doors swung open, revealing a group of FBI agents clad in dark tactical gear. They stepped out with purpose, their boots hitting the pavement in unison, guns drawn and trained squarely on him. In that fleeting moment, David's entire world unraveled. He stood frozen in the desolate street, the emptiness around him amplifying the deafening thud of his own heartbeat. There was no running, no hiding, only the crushing realization that his reign had ended. Louise, standing a few paces away, cast one final glance his way. Her eyes, usually stern and unyielding, flickered with a trace of pity, a subtle crack in her otherwise unshakable demeanor. Yet her confidence stood firm, a towering wall he could neither breach nor ignore. "You crossed a line, David," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the night like a blade. "And now you're going to face the price." His arms fell limp at his sides, his breath escaping in jagged, uneven bursts. His mind spun wildly, grasping for an escape that didn't exist. The agents closed in with swift precision, their movements a blur as cold steel handcuffs snapped around his wrists, biting into his skin. This was no mere arrest. It was the collapse of a nightmare he'd never dared to envision, now swallowing him whole. A white cop, once swaggering with authority, now reduced to a humiliated figure on the very streets he'd claimed as his kingdom. As the agents tugged him toward the waiting vehicles, Louise's words lingered in the air, looping through his mind like a haunting refrain. "You're not the only one who'll pay, David. This is just the beginning." He couldn't muster a response. His gaze drifted, unfocused, his hands numb within the cuff's icy grip. The weight of her warning settled over him. This wasn't the end, but the opening act of a terror far darker than he'd ever imagined. Later, sprawled across the frigid steel bed in a holding cell, David's thoughts churned in a chaotic storm. The man he'd been, unassailable, untouchable, had been forged over years behind a badge. From the day he'd pinned it to his chest, he'd believed it granted him dominion. The uniform, the gleaming badge, the weight of the gun holstered at his hip, they weren't just tools, they were extensions of his will, symbols of a power he wielded without restraint. He'd grown addicted to it, using that authority to intimidate, to control, to crush those he deemed lesser. Black faces, in particular, had borne the brunt of his disdain, their fear feeding his ego like fuel to a flame. But now, that illusion of invincibility was shattering, splinter by splinter, leaving behind a hollow shell consumed by dread. He couldn't fathom it. How a black woman of all people had toppled him. Louise, with her slight frame and unassuming presence, had dismantled the towering arrogance he'd built brick by brick. She'd dragged him from the pedestal of power into this suffocating cell, a cage with no windows, no mercy, no way out. The creak of the cell door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. It groaned on its hinges as Louise stepped inside, her frail exterior shed like a discarded mask. She stood tall now, an FBI agent radiating authority, her arms cradling a dossier thick with evidence, every misstep, every abuse, every crime he'd committed laid bare. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, sliced through the bravado he'd clung to for so long. He'd spent years watching black people shrink before him, their eyes averted, their voices silenced by his mere presence, but not her. Louise carried no trace of fear, no flicker of doubt. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Her voice pierced the heavy silence, calm yet laced with an edge that made his skin prickle. "You've gone too far, David, and now it's time to answer for every life you've scarred." He bristled, his instincts kicking in like a cornered beast. "You can't touch me," he snarled, his voice rough with defiance. "You're just an old black woman. No one gives a damn about you. I'm a cop. I've put away plenty of your kind." He forced a sneer, clinging to the tattered remnants of his pride, but inside, he felt the cracks widening, his confidence crumbling like dry earth. Louise didn't flinch. She stood rooted, her piercing gaze unwavering, slicing through his bluster with surgical precision. "You still don't see it, do you?" she said, her tone steady as stone. "You think you're untouchable, above the law. But you're wrong. I've been tracking you for months. Every act of violence, every racist word, every abuse of power. We have it all, and it's going to bury you." His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding as he fought to hold on to the last threads of his dignity. "I don't care what you say," he spat, his voice rising. "I don't regret a thing. I'm a cop. I do my job. Those black people in this neighborhood? They need to know their place, and I made sure they did." She watched him, her expression calm yet heavy with the weight of someone who'd witnessed this venom before. "You think you can brutalize people and walk away unscathed? That black lives are yours to trample because you wear a badge? You're mistaken, David. And now justice is here to collect." The room crackled with tension, a pressure so thick it seemed to press against his chest. Unable to contain the fury boiling within, he lurched from the bed, lunging toward her with a guttural roar. But the handcuffs yanked him back, and the two agents flanking her stepped forward, their presence a silent warning. "I'm not scared of you," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You think you can take me down? You'll never break me." A faint cold smile curled Louise's lips, not one of triumph but of pity for the fool before her. "You're not in charge anymore, David," she said softly, each word a dagger to his core. "You're not the cop who terrorizes at will. You're a criminal now, and no one's coming to save you." Her words struck deep, piercing the heart of his defiance. The fight drained from him, his body slumping back onto the bed. For the first time he felt it, the power he'd wielded so carelessly slipping through his fingers, leaving him small, vulnerable, controlled. Desperation flooded his veins as he stared at the ceiling, the dim bulb above casting jagged shadows that mirrored the wreckage of the man he'd once been. David had never pictured this. A reckoning for the actions he'd dismissed as routine. Every day he'd strode through these streets, basking in the deference of those he passed, reveling in the fear that glinted in the eyes of the black residents he loathed. Now, that dynamic had flipped. He was the one trembling, the one stripped bare. Sleep had become a distant memory in recent weeks, his nights plagued by vivid, tormenting visions. Faces of those he'd wronged, men he'd beaten without cause, women he'd cursed with smug satisfaction, swirled in his mind, their silent accusations clawing at his sanity. The badge that once shielded him now lay discarded, his corruption exposed to the unforgiving light. But the true terror loomed larger still. Lieutenant John Harper, the linchpin of the corrupt network David had served. Harper wasn't just a superior. He was a force, ruthless and unrelenting, a man who crushed dissent without hesitation. David had thrived under his protection, but crossing him was unthinkable. One night, as David wrestled with sleeplessness, the cell door creaked open again. A figure slipped inside, his face obscured by shadow, his eyes glinting with menace. "Harper sends his regards," the man whispered, his voice a chilling breeze that froze David's blood. Before he could respond, the stranger vanished, leaving David alone in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. Panic surged, relentless and suffocating. Harper knew David might crack under the FBI's pressure, might spill secrets to save himself. And Harper didn't tolerate loose ends. If David talked, Harper's vengeance would be swift and merciless. If he didn't, the law would claim him anyway. Either path led to ruin, his career, his freedom, his life, all teetering on the edge of oblivion. In the days that followed, Louise's interrogations became a relentless siege, each question stabbed at his pride, forcing him to confront the ugliness of his deeds. "Harper won't let you go," she said during one session, her voice low but laden with truth. "You're running out of moves, David. Do you really think he'll let you live if you stay silent? He'll cut you loose to save himself. He always does." David's throat tightened, words failing him. She was right, and that truth gnawed at him. Justice, once a tool he'd twisted to his will, now loomed as an unyielding force, its scales tipping against him. The lesson was brutal and clear. Power abused carried a cost, and no badge could shield him from the consequences closing in. The air in the interrogation room hung thick and heavy, the kind of stillness that pressed against David's chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He sat there, slumped in a metal chair that creaked under his shifting frame, his hands trembling uncontrollably as they rested on the scratched tabletop. His world, once a fortress built on authority and unshakable loyalty, had crumbled, leaving him stranded between two relentless forces. On one side loomed Harper, a man whose cold, calculating resolve had kept their corrupt empire intact for years, a predator who'd tear David apart without hesitation if he sensed betrayal. On the other stood Louise, unyielding and razor-sharp, her piercing eyes cutting through every lie David had ever told himself. She'd unearthed the rotting truth of his life, the dark secrets he'd buried deep, convinced they'd never see daylight. Now those deeds clawed their way to the surface, and David could feel the walls closing in. His head bowed low, the faint hum of the flickering fluorescent light above buzzing in his ears like a swarm of accusations. He'd spent his career shielded by power, thriving in its shadow, believing it made him untouchable. But that same power had turned on him, a double-edged sword now poised to slice through everything he'd built. Harper wouldn't blink at silencing him. David knew that too well. The man's ruthlessness was a quiet, simmering thing, the kind that didn't need words to terrify. Yet Louise held something just as dangerous. Evidence, cold and irrefutable. A noose tightening around David's neck with every passing second. There was no slipping away. No quiet retreat into the life he'd known. He was trapped. A man staring into the abyss of his own making. It was early morning when the decision came, the weak sunlight spilling through the grimy window of the interrogation room, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. David's throat burned, raw from sleepless nights and the bitter taste of fear. He lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes meeting Louise's steady gaze. "Okay," he rasped, the word scraping its way out like a jagged confession. "I'll talk." His voice trembled, heavy with the weight of what he was about to unleash. He locked eyes with her, desperation flickering in his stare, a plea woven into his next words. "But I need protection. Harper, he'll kill me if he finds out I've said anything." His breath hitched, the reality of his betrayal sinking in like a stone. Louise didn't flinch. Her expression remained carved from steel, though a faint nod acknowledged his request. "You'll get protection," she said, her voice calm but edged with an unspoken ultimatum. "But only if you give us everything. No half-truths, no holding back. Harper and the rest of that department, they need to be exposed, root and stem." Her eyes never wavered, pinning him to the spot, stripping away any illusion of control he might have clung to. David inhaled deeply, the air tasting stale and suffocating. He knew what this meant. Once he opened his mouth, there'd be no undoing it. The colleagues he'd once laughed with, fought beside, shared in the brutal dance of power. They'd see him as a traitor, a coward who'd sold them out to save his own skin. He could already imagine their sneers, the venom in their voices as they turned their backs on him. But what choice did he have? He'd helped Harper build this trap, brick by brick, and now it had snapped shut around him. With a shuddering breath, he began to speak, and in that moment, his life veered onto a path he could never retrace. The days that followed were a blur of revelations, each word David spilled to the FBI, peeling back another layer of the corruption he and Harper had woven into the police department's fabric. He spoke of Harper's iron grip, how he'd shielded guilty officers from accountability, buried evidence of unreported murders, and twisted the system into a weapon against the powerless. Every confession painted a grotesque portrait of a department where justice had been replaced by tyranny, where power wasn't just abused, it was wielded like a club to crush anyone who didn't fit the mold. David's voice grew hoarse as he recounted the details, his hands fidgeting nervously, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill of the room. Harper, meanwhile, wasn't a man to sit still while his kingdom unraveled. He could sense the danger creeping closer, a shadow cast by David's betrayal and the FBI's relentless pursuit. In the precinct, tension crackled like static. Harper paced his office, his jaw tight, his mind racing as he shredded documents and barked orders at his loyal lieutenants. He leaned on old allies, his voice low and menacing as he pressured them to stay silent, to hold the line. But whispers of the investigation had already begun to spread, seeping through the cracks of his control. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that the FBI had sunk their hooks deep, gathering threads of evidence that were weaving into a net he couldn't escape. Louise led her team with a quiet ferocity, working late into the night, her desk buried under files and photographs. She pieced together the puzzle of Harper's reign, every lead David provided fueling her determination to see him fall. For David, there was no going back. Branded a snitch, he lived with the constant hum of dread, knowing the men he'd once called brothers now saw him as the enemy. But his testimony didn't just topple Harper. It cracked open a sprawling web of rot that stretched from the beat cops on the street to the brass in their polished offices. What haunted him most wasn't the violence he'd inflicted, but the subtler cruelties, the way they'd targeted black communities, using their badges as a license to oppress, to degrade, to destroy. The interrogation room became his confessional, a cold, sterile space where the truth poured out of him like poison. Sweat soaked through his shirt, his voice cracking as he laid bare the racial hatred that had festered under Harper's command. He'd always told himself he was just doing his job, enforcing order, keeping the streets safe. But now, stripped of that delusion, he saw himself for what he was, a cog in a machine built to grind down the vulnerable. He remembered the faces, black men and women he'd beaten, humiliated, arrested on flimsy pretenses, their only crime being their skin. Harper had drilled it into them. Black people were threats, inherently lawless, unworthy of trust. And David had believed it, acted on it, fed it with every swing of his fist. Louise sat across from him, her presence a steady, unyielding force. Her eyes were icy, but not cruel. There was no gloating in her stare, just a quiet resolve that unnerved him more than anger ever could. "Do you realize what you've done, David?" she asked one day, her voice low and cutting, slicing through the fog of his excuses. "This wasn't just Harper. It was a system, a machine you helped build, fueled by your own racism, your own hatred. You didn't just follow orders, you made it stronger." She leaned forward slightly, her words a mirror he couldn't look away from. "You beat innocent people. You humiliated them, all because they were black." David's gaze dropped to the floor, his stomach twisting. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the weight of her words crushed any defiance he might have mustered. He saw it now, the full, ugly scope of his life laid bare. He'd been no mere bystander. He'd been an architect of injustice, a willing hand in a system that thrived on oppression. The memories flooded back, the crack of his baton against a young man's ribs, the sneer on his lips as he hauled a woman to the ground, the casual brutality he'd shrugged off as routine. Each act had been a brick in the wall of corruption he now longed to tear down. "We've got enough to take down Harper and plenty of others," Louise continued, her pen scratching against her notepad as she recorded his every word. "But you need to tell us more, not just about Harper, about everyone. Who else was in on it? What did you see?" Her tone was firm, leaving no room for evasion. David lifted his head, his eyes red and hollow. "I wasn't the only one," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harper gave the orders, but we all followed. He told us to control the black neighborhoods, said if there was even a hint of trouble, we didn't need proof to act. We'd rough them up, question them, lock them up for nothing. Sometimes just seeing a black kid walking in a white area was enough. Harper said they didn't belong there, that they were trouble waiting to happen. And we bought it, all of us." Louise's eyebrow arched slightly, but she said nothing, letting his words hang in the air like a confession to an empty cathedral. The silence was suffocating, forcing David to confront the enormity of what he'd done. Racism wasn't just a fleeting prejudice. It had been codified, weaponized, draped in the authority of their uniforms. He and his fellow officers had turned the law into a tool of terror, and Harper had been the maestro conducting their cruelty. "So what now, David?" Louise asked at last, her gaze locking onto his. "Are you going to keep talking? Keep exposing Harper and the rest? Or are you still trying to shield them?" He swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. There was no turning back. He'd crossed that line the moment he'd opened his mouth. "I'll keep talking," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'll tell you about the fake investigations, the arrests we staged, the times we covered for each other when things went too far. Harper made racism our routine. I'll give you all of it." Outside, Harper's world was collapsing. Word of the FBI's probe had spread like wildfire through the precinct, and he scrambled to hold his crumbling empire together. He reached out to old contacts, his voice dripping with veiled threats as he tried to bribe or bully them into silence. But the FBI was a step ahead, their evidence mounting with every name David dropped. Harper's loyalists began to waver, distancing themselves as the heat intensified. He destroyed files in a frantic bid to erase his tracks, but it was too late. The truth was spilling out faster than he could bury it. The end came swiftly. In the gray light of dawn, FBI agents stormed Harper's home, yanking him from his bed as he blinked in stunned disbelief. Gone was the swaggering lieutenant who'd ruled with an iron fist. In his place stood a disheveled man, handcuffs biting into his wrists, his empire reduced to ash. As they dragged him to the car, he turned to the agents, defiance glinting in his eyes. "You can lock me up," he snarled, "but this system? It's bigger than me. You'll never kill it." Louise watched from a distance, her face unreadable. She knew he wasn't entirely wrong. The corruption he'd nurtured was a hydra, its heads sprawling far beyond one man. But that didn't mean she'd stop. Later, in the interrogation room, she turned to David. "We don't need to destroy it all at once," she said, her voice steady. "We'll dismantle it, piece by piece, starting with you and Harper." David said nothing. His head bowed once more. He'd betrayed Harper, turned his back on the only life he'd known. But he also understood that this was just the beginning. The system he'd helped build wouldn't fall with a single blow. It would take time, persistence, and a reckoning he could barely fathom. For now, he'd keep talking, spilling every secret, knowing each word was a step toward justice, and a reminder of the consequences when power becomes a tyrant's tool. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy, thick with tension and the faint scent of stale coffee. David sat slumped in a metal chair, his shirt clinging to his skin, drenched in cold sweat that beaded along his forehead and trickled down his temples. His hands, once steady and sure when wielding a baton or cuffing a suspect, now trembled faintly, betraying the storm raging inside him. For days, he had been unraveling the tangled mess of his past, spilling every detail he could muster about Lieutenant John Harper. But it wasn't just Harper's name that haunted him. It was the realization of what he himself had done, the weight of a career built on a foundation of racial hatred that now pressed down on his chest like a leaden shroud. He had always told himself he was upholding the law, a good cop doing a tough job. Yet as the truth spilled out under the harsh fluorescent lights, he saw it for what it was. A life spent enforcing not justice, but oppression. Across the scratched steel table, Louise sat with a posture that radiated quiet authority. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, cut through the haze of David's guilt like a blade, but there was no trace of the venom or rage he'd braced himself for. That absence unnerved him more than any outburst could have. Where he expected fire, there was only ice, calm, resolute, and utterly unforgiving. Every time he stumbled over his words, groping for some flimsy excuse to soften the ugliness of his actions, she'd tilt her head slightly, a subtle shake that silenced him more effectively than a shout. There was no hiding from her gaze, no corner of his conscience left unexposed. "Do you even grasp what you've done, David?" Her voice was low, deliberate, each word slicing through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "This isn't just about Harper. It's about a whole system. A machine you didn't just stumble into but helped construct, piece by piece, with your own hands. You fueled it with your prejudice, your hate. Do you see that?" David's breath hitched, a shaky inhale that rattled in his throat. His eyes dropped to the floor, fixing on a scuff mark etched into the cracked linoleum. He'd once worn his badge with pride, a shield of righteousness he'd polished daily in his mind. Now that image shattered, replaced by memories he couldn't unsee, moments of cruelty he'd dismissed as routine. The black teenager he'd shoved against a brick wall, the crack of his fist against a man's jaw just for walking too slowly in the wrong neighborhood, the handcuffs he'd snapped on wrists without a shred of evidence. He'd told himself they were threats, every one of them, because their skin was darker, because Harper had drilled it into him that black people were born guilty. The truth clawed at him now. He hadn't just followed orders, he'd reveled in them. Outside the room, the world was shifting fast. David's testimony had lit a match and the flames were racing through the police department, exposing a sprawling network of corruption and racial violence that reached from the grimiest beat cops to the polished brass at the top. It wasn't just the brutality that chilled the bone. It was the subtlety of it all, the insidious ways they'd tightened the noose. Fake reports filed in dimly lit precincts, arrests made on nothing more than a glance, entire communities branded as dangerous to justify the heavy hand they wielded. Officers he'd once shared beers with, laughed with, had been part of it, comrades in a war against people who'd never stood a chance. Louise leaned forward slightly, her pen scratching across a notepad as she pressed him further. We've got enough to nail Harper and a dozen others, but that's not the end of it. You need to tell me everything. Who else was in on it? What did you see, David? Not just Harper's orders, but the others who nodded along, who carried out the same dirty work. Her tone was steady, but there was an edge to it, a demand that brooked no evasion. He lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed and glassy from nights spent staring at the ceiling of his cell, replaying every choice that had led him here. It wasn't just me, he rasped, his voice rough as gravel. Harper was the one barking the orders, sure, but we all followed. There were guys, Jenkins, O'Malley, even quiet little Pete down in records, who'd jump the second Harper said, "Control the black blocks." If we saw so much as a shadow move funny, we had the green light to act. No questions. No proof needed. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles whitening. We'd drag them in, rough them up, hold them for hours, sometimes just for existing too close to a white street. Harper'd say they couldn't be trusted, that they were ticking time bombs waiting to go off, and we bought it, every damn word. The room fell silent, the weight of his confession settling like dust after an explosion. Louise didn't flinch, didn't fill the void with words. She let it sit there, a mirror held up to the wreckage of David's soul. Racism wasn't just a fleeting thought or a muttered slur, it was the backbone of the system he'd served, woven into every report, every arrest, every swing of a baton. The uniform he'd worn hadn't been a symbol of protection. It was a weapon, and he'd swung it without hesitation. Meanwhile, beyond the concrete walls, Harper was scrambling. Word of the FBI's investigation had slithered through the precinct like a venomous snake, and panic rippled in its wake. The man who'd once strutted through the station with the swagger of untouchability now paced his cluttered apartment, phone pressed to his ear as he barked desperate pleas to old allies. He'd tried everything. Offers of cash slipped into sweaty handshakes, veiled threats growled over burner phones, but the net was tightening. The FBI had dug up too much. Falsified reports bearing his signature, witnesses to hushed-up killings, a trail of shredded evidence that led straight to his desk. His loyalists, cops who'd once saluted him with unwavering devotion, were peeling away, whispering denials to save their own skins. The raid came at dawn, a symphony of pounding fists and splintering wood. Harper jolted awake, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, as agents stormed his bedroom. Gone was the cocky lieutenant who'd ruled with an iron fist. In his place was a disheveled figure, wide-eyed and sputtering as cold steel clamped around his wrists. Dragged to the waiting car, he twisted to glare at the agents, defiance flickering in his gaze like a dying ember. "Lock me up all you want," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "But this system? It's bigger than me. You'll never tear it down." Louise watched from a distance, her face a mask of cool detachment. She knew there was truth in his taunt. The rot ran deep, a sprawling beast with roots too tangled to rip out in one fell swoop. But she wasn't here to topple it overnight. "We don't have to destroy it," she said later, back in the interrogation room with David. "We'll dismantle it brick by brick, starting with you and Harper." Her words were a promise, steady and unshakable, a vow to see justice carved out of the chaos. David said nothing, his throat tight with the bitter taste of his own betrayal. He'd turned on Harper, on the brotherhood he'd once clung to, and there was no going back. But even as he spilled more, fake raids, trumped-up charges, the sick camaraderie of covering for each other, he knew this was only the beginning. The machine he'd helped build wouldn't crumble with a handful of arrests. It would fight to survive, just as he'd fought to justify his place in it. For Louise, every word David spoke was a chisel strike against that machine, a lesson in the slow, brutal cost of justice. For Harper, it was the end of a reign built on fear and power, a stark reminder that even the mightiest fall when their foundations crack. And for David, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to a life of violence and hate, forcing him to face the man he'd become. The consequences of abusing power didn't just topple tyrants like Harper. They rippled inward, stripping bare the souls of those who'd wielded it without question. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't just a punishment. It was a revelation. In a dimly lit room, the air thick with tension, Louise sat poised with her notepad, her pen hovering over the page as she arched an eyebrow at David. His testimony spilled out like a confession long buried, each word trembling with the weight of guilt. "What did you do with that power?" she asked, her voice steady but cutting, a blade slicing through the haze of his excuses. David's throat tightened, his hands shaking as if they still carried the bruises of the past. "We beat them," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We questioned them without reason, locked them up without cause. Sometimes, just seeing a black person walking through a white neighborhood was enough for us to haul them in. Harper, he drilled it into us. Black people couldn't be trusted, that they were always a potential threat waiting to strike, and we bought it. I bought it." The silence that followed was suffocating, a heavy fog settling over the room. Louise didn't flinch, her dark eyes locked on David, letting the stillness amplify the ugliness of his words. This wasn't just prejudice whispered in dark corners. It was a system, a machine oiled with racism and legitimized by the badges they wore. David and his fellow officers had twisted their authority into a weapon, one that crushed lives beneath its weight. The uniform, meant to protect, had become a shroud for oppression, and David's trembling hands were proof he knew it. Louise broke the quiet, her tone deliberate. "So what now, David? Are you going to keep testifying against Harper and the others, or are you still shielding them?" Her gaze pinned him like a specimen under glass. David's chest heaved. He'd cracked the dam, and there was no stopping the flood now. "I'll keep talking," he said, his voice quivering like a leaf in the wind. "I'll tell you everything. How we staged fake investigations, arrested innocent people, covered for each other when the blood got too thick. Harper made racism our daily bread, and I ate it up." Outside, beyond the sterile walls of the interrogation room, the world was shifting. Harper, the ringleader of this rotting empire, paced his office, his polished shoes clicking against the floor as sweat beaded on his brow. Word of the FBI's investigation had slithered through the precinct like a venomous snake, and he could feel the coils tightening. He'd spent years building this fortress of power, brick by brick, with allies in high places and a network of loyal officers. Now, it was crumbling. Desperation clawed at him as he dialed old contacts, his voice low and urgent, offering bribes to slow the inevitable or threats to silence the weak. But the FBI had too many threads, too many witnesses like David unraveling the tapestry of lies. Harper's empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing, and he was running out of moves. As the investigation deepened, the FBI peeled back layers of filth. Harper hadn't just shielded racist cops like David. He'd been the architect of falsified reports, a maestro conducting a symphony of cover-ups for police killings. Important files vanished in shredders, their ashes scattered by officers still loyal to him, though even they were starting to slink away, sensing the end. The raid came at dawn, a thunderclap shattering the stillness of Harper's suburban home. FBI agents stormed in, their boots pounding the hardwood as they dragged him from his bed. His hair was tousled, his eyes wide with shock. No longer the swaggering lieutenant barking orders, but a man stripped bare, facing the wreckage of his reign. They slapped cuffs on his wrists, the metal cold against his skin, and shoved him toward the car. Yet even then, defiance flickered in his glare. He turned to the agents, his voice icy despite the tremble in his hands. "You can lock me up, but this system, it'll never change. You'll never tear it down." Louise watched from the sidelines, her face a mask of calm resolve. She knew Harper wasn't entirely wrong. The roots of this corruption ran deep, tangled in the soil of a system built to favor the powerful. But that didn't mean surrender. Later, in another sterile room with David, she leaned forward, her words measured but firm. "We don't need to burn it all down, David. We'll change it, piece by piece, starting with people like you and Harper." David stared at the table, his silence louder than any confession. He'd turned on Harper, spilled every secret, but the weight of his betrayal, and his crimes pressed down on him like a millstone. He'd been a cog in this brutal machine, and now, as it ground to a halt, he'd have to face the fallout. There were no more chances, no more excuses, just the cold reality of consequences. The FBI's net widened, snaring more officers in its grasp. Harper wasn't the lone villain. He was just the loudest. High-ranking officials, men in crisp suits with polished reputations, had greased the wheels of this corruption, burying misconduct, faking reports, wielding their power like a club. Some scrambled to shred evidence, their hands shaking as they fed papers into machines, but the FBI had already locked away too much. Beyond the precinct, the black community, long battered by this tyranny, rose up. Streets pulsed with protests, voices raw with decades of pain, shouting for justice. One man, his face bruised from a beating he'd taken during a wrongful arrest, stood before a news camera, his voice trembling but fierce. "We're not criminals. We just want to live, breathe, walk, exist. But they treated us like garbage because of our skin." His words ignited the crowd, a spark catching dry tinder, and the protests swelled, a tidal wave crashing against years of silence. This wasn't about one rogue cop or a handful of bad apples. It was a reckoning for a system designed to oppress. The media seized the story, broadcasting the rot to a stunned public. False charges, excessive force, intimidation, all wielded like tools of terror against black lives. Officers once hailed as guardians were now exposed as predators, stalking the vulnerable. For David, the shift was seismic. He'd once strutted through precinct halls, chest puffed with pride, believing himself a keeper of order. Now, in his cramped cell, he saw the truth. He'd been a puppet, a blunt instrument swung by men like Harper. Night after night, the faces of those he'd wronged haunted him. A young man slammed against a wall, a mother pleading as her son was dragged away. His testimony had toppled Harper, but it couldn't wash the blood from his hands. He'd live with that stain forever. Harper, meanwhile, clung to his arrogance like a drowning man to driftwood. At his trial, he sat ramrod straight, his jaw tight, repeating the same hollow line, "I was just doing my job." He refused to bend, to acknowledge the lives he'd shattered, but the evidence buried him. Piles of documents, recordings, witnesses painting a portrait of a sprawling web of corruption. It wasn't just Harper. Officers, politicians, even local business owners had fattened their pockets by exploiting the powerless. The city reeled as the truth sank in, and change began to stir. With Harper and his cronies behind bars, the police department faced a purge. New training rooted in anti-racism, de-escalation tactics, stronger oversight from internal affairs, and community boards to keep officers in check. Louise took the helm of a task force to enforce these reforms, her resolve unshaken. It was a fragile start, a single step on a jagged road, but it was something. David's fate was sealed. A reduced sentence for his cooperation, but a life confined to a cell, his spirit as broken as his body. He'd helped dismantle the beast, but in doing so, he'd lost himself. Harper got life, his defiance echoing even from his prison cot. "This system won't change," he sneered to anyone who'd listen. "There'll always be another me." Louise, though, saw a flicker of possibility. Change was slow, a grinding uphill climb, but the voices of the oppressed, once muffled, now roared. That was the seed of justice, fragile but growing. In his cell, David traced the cracks in the wall, replaying the choices that had led him here. He'd once thought power made him untouchable, but it was a house of cards, built on the backs of the innocent. When it fell, it took him with it, leaving only regret. The city, scarred but stirring, began to heal. The police department shed its old skin, no longer a monolith of fear. Trust crept in, tentative and wary, but real. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, yet hope lingered in the air, a whisper that things could change. Harper's downfall and the collapse of his corrupt network stood as a stark lesson. When power is twisted to crush, the innocent bleed, and justice demands a price. But the community's resilience, bolstered by warriors like Louise, proved that even the deepest shadows could be pierced by light. Change was a battle, not a gift, and it started with those brave enough to stand. David, Harper, and the system they served showed the cost of abuse. Fragile empires fall, and those who build them pay. Yet in the echoes of protest and the slow grind of reform, a truth emerged. Justice, though delayed, could still rise.